When did dogs become man's best friend? Dogs are everywhere in human life, sleeping on couches, walking beside us on sidewalks, waiting at doors, and looking at us like they understand more than they should. But there was a time when none of that existed. There were no pets, no companions, no loyal animals waiting at home, just humans trying to survive in a dangerous world, and wolves, living completely separate lives in the wild, often as rivals rather than allies. So, how did that change? When did a wild predator, an animal once treated as a threat, become something we now call man's best friend? The truth is, dogs didn't become man's best friend in a single moment. It was a slow, uneven process that likely began at least 15,000 to 30,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. What we recognize today as companionship is the result of thousands of generations of coevolution between humans and the ancestor of modern dogs, the gray wolf. And it didn't start with trust or intention. It started with proximity, survival, and the species slowly learning how to share the same world. Before dogs, a hostile relationship with wolves. Long before the dog existed in any recognizable form, the world was shared between early humans and their most formidable wild neighbor, the gray wolf. This was not a relationship built on trust, familiarity, or even cautious cooperation. It was shaped by competition, risk, and survival in environments where every calorie mattered and every encounter carried danger. Early humans lived in small, vulnerable groups, relying on hunting, gathering, and constant movement to stay alive. In the same landscapes, forests, grasslands, and cold steppe regions, wolves thrived as highly organized pack hunters. Both species targeted similar prey such as deer, elk, and smaller herd animals. That overlap alone made conflict almost inevitable. Food was not abundant or guaranteed, and any competitor reduced the chances of survival. For wolves, humans were neither allies nor curiosities. They were competitors who sometimes left behind useful remains but also posed a threat when encountered in groups. For humans, wolves represented both danger and frustration, predators capable of tracking, outcompeting, or scavenging the results of a successful hunt. A wounded animal or poorly defended camp could quickly become an opportunity for a pack of wolves. In such moments, wolves were not distant symbols of wilderness, they were immediate risks. Encounters between the two species were likely tense and reactive, rather than prolonged. A wolf pack testing the edges of a human camp might be driven off by fire, noise, or coordinated resistance. Humans, in turn, would avoid territories known to contain active packs whenever possible. There was little room for tolerance because survival margins were so narrow. Even in direct competition like scavenging, the same carcass could escalate into confrontation. This dynamic reinforced a clear boundary. Humans stayed within their settlements and movement routes, while wolves operated as territorial predators across wider ranges. The idea of coexistence in a shared social sense did not exist. Instead, both species maintained distance whenever possible, interacting only when their paths crossed due to necessity or opportunity. Yet even in this hostile relationship, something important was unfolding beneath the surface. Wolves are intelligent, adaptable animals with complex social structures, and not all individuals behaved identically. Some were more cautious around human activity. Some were less aggressive when encountering camps. These behavioral differences, initially minor, would later become the foundation for one of the most unusual transformations in natural history. But in this early stage, none of that future was visible. What defined the relationship was still dominance, avoidance, and competition. Humans were not yet living alongside dogs. They were simply trying to survive in a world where the ancestors of dogs were still very much wolves, and wolves were still very much wild. The first encounter, living on the edge of camps, at some point deep in prehistory, the long-standing distance between early humans and the gray wolf began to shift, not through cooperation or intention, but through opportunity created by human life itself. Early human groups were not stationary civilizations. They were small, mobile bands that followed seasonal food sources, moving through forests, river valleys, and open grasslands. Wherever they settled temporarily, they left behind traces of their existence, bones from hunted animals, scraps of meat, discarded organs, and the remains of daily survival. To us, these would look like waste. To wildlife, they were a resource. For certain wolves, especially those less aggressive or more exploratory, human camps began to represent something new in the landscape, a predictable source of food without the effort and risk of hunting. Instead of taking down large prey, some wolves could simply wait at a safe distance and feed on leftovers once humans had finished their meals. This behavior did not require trust. It required only tolerance for proximity and a willingness to exploit opportunity. From the human side, something unusual was also happening. Early humans were not able to fully eliminate scavengers from their environment, but they were observant enough to notice patterns. Wolves that lingered near camps could act as an unintended alarm system. Their howls and movements sometimes signaled the presence of other predators or competing groups. Even without direct interaction, their presence had informational value. Over time, a fragile and informal boundary formed around human camps. Too close, and wolves risked confrontation. Too far, and they lost access to food. This created a narrow edge zone, where only the most cautious individuals could persist. Within this zone, behavior mattered more than strength. Aggressive wolves were more likely to be driven away or killed during encounters. Highly fearful wolves avoided camps altogether, but wolves that were neither overly aggressive nor overly fearful found a niche, close enough to benefit, distant enough to survive. This subtle filtering process began to reshape wolf behavior in ways that were not immediately visible. The animals that stayed near humans were not fundamentally different at first. They were simply those whose temperaments allowed them to tolerate stress, noise, fire, and human presence. Yet those small behavioral differences had large consequences over time. Each generation, the wolves that survived near camps passed on traits that made their offspring slightly more suited to this unusual environment. For humans, this relationship was still not a partnership. There was no sense of companionship, no shared understanding, and certainly no emotional bond. Wolves were still wild animals operating at the edge of human life, but they were no longer entirely separate from it. They had become a constant presence seen at dawn and dusk, circling at a distance, disappearing into the darkness only to return when opportunity allowed. This edge of camp dynamic marked a turning point that was easy to miss in real time, but profound in hindsight. It was the first step toward domestication, not because humans chose it, but because both species found a way to coexist in the narrow space between danger and benefit. In that space, quiet, unstable, and unintentional, the relationship between humans and wolves began to change forever. Survival of the friendliest. The transformation from wild wolf to the dog did not begin with humans actively domesticating animals in any planned sense. Instead, it likely emerged from a slow and unintentional filter, acting on behavior itself, one that favored calmness over aggression, tolerance over fear, and curiosity over avoidance. This process is often described as survival of the friendliest. Though friendliest here does not mean affectionate, it means survivable in the unusual environment created by human presence. The ancestors of modern dogs, the gray wolf, were highly adaptable pack hunters. Within any population of wolves, there was natural variation in temperament. Some individuals were highly reactive, quick to aggression when threatened or when competing for food. Others were more cautious, less likely to engage in direct conflict, and more willing to observe before acting. In the wild, both strategies could work depending on conditions, but near human settlements, only one of them consistently led to survival. Human camps were unpredictable environments filled with fire, noise, tools, and coordinated group defense. Wolves that approached to aggressively risked injury or death. Wolves that were too fearful never gained access to the valuable resources available at the edges of camps. This created a narrow behavioral middle ground, where only individuals with a specific combination of traits could thrive: low aggression, high tolerance for stress, and a willingness to remain close without attacking. Over generations, this acted like a filter on the wolf population living near humans. Those that survived were not necessarily stronger or faster in the traditional sense. They were behaviorally different. They were more socially flexible, more observant, and more capable of reading cues from another species without immediate hostility. These traits, once rare, became more common simply because individuals who possessed them had better access to food and higher survival rates in human-adjacent environments. Importantly, humans did not need to understand this process for it to occur. There was no requirement for training or intentional breeding at the earliest stages. The environment itself did the selecting. Wolves that could coexist at a distance from humans gained a steady advantage, discarded food, protection from other predators, and a relatively stable niche compared to the unpredictability of full wild hunting. Over time, this created a feedback loop. More tolerant wolves stayed closer to humans. Humans became more accustomed to their presence. Some wolves began to learn human routines, responding to patterns of activity such as hunting returns, fire maintenance, or sleep cycles. While still not domesticated in the modern sense, they were becoming increasingly specialized for life at the boundary of human society. This shift also changed the social experience of both species. Wolves are naturally social animals, and those living near humans may have begun redirecting their social instincts toward a new pack structure that included humans as consistent figures in their environment. Humans, in turn, may have begun to recognize individual wolves or wolf groups that were less threatening, gradually reducing hostility toward them over time. What makes this stage so important is that it represents a turning point without intention. No single decision created domestication. Instead, 1,000 small survival advantages accumulated across countless generations, slowly reshaping the relationship between two species that had once been purely competitors. In the end, survival of the friendliest does not describe kindness in the modern, emotional sense. It describes a selective pressure that rewarded tolerance in the shadow of human life. From that pressure, the foundation of one of the most extraordinary partnerships in natural history quietly began to form, from wolves to working partners. By the time early humans and the ancestors of the dog had established a stable presence around shared landscapes, something fundamental had already shifted. The animals lingering near human camps were no longer purely wild in behavior. Even if they were still genetically close to the gray wolf, they were becoming specialists of a new ecological niche, life shaped by human activity. At first, this relationship was accidental. Wolves that tolerated humans gained access to food scraps and predictable scavenging opportunities. Humans, in turn, benefited indirectly from their presence. Wolves acted as natural guards at the edge of camps, reacting quickly to unfamiliar sounds or approaching predators. Even without intentional cooperation, the arrangement created a form of mutual advantage. But over time, this passive coexistence began to shift into something more structured and reliable. Humans are pattern-recognizing animals. Over generations, they likely began noticing that certain wolves were consistently less threatening and more predictable in their behavior. These individuals did not charge into camps or retreat at the slightest movement. Instead, they maintained distance, observed human activity, and responded in ways that suggested caution rather than aggression. In environments where trust had to be earned through repetition rather than intention, consistency mattered more than anything else. This is where the transition from scavengers to working partners begins to emerge. Wolves that remained near humans were occasionally present during hunts, not as participants, but as opportunistic followers. They would track human groups, sometimes picking up on the direction of prey or the aftermath of a kill. Over time, their presence became associated with outcomes. Where humans hunted successfully, scavenging opportunities followed. In this indirect way, wolves began to learn human patterns, and humans began to notice the advantages of having them nearby. The relationship likely deepened through simple forms of tolerance and reinforcement. A wolf that stayed nearby without causing conflict might be allowed to remain. One that showed useful behavior such as alerting humans to danger or keeping distance from stored food would be less likely to be driven away. No formal training was required. Selection happened through survival outcomes. Who stayed close, who got fed, who was tolerated, and who was not. Gradually, these interactions created a functional division of labor. Even before true domestication had fully taken hold, humans provided a stable base of activity camps, kills, shelter, and predictable movement patterns. Wolves provided sensory awareness and environmental responsiveness, hearing, smell, vigilance, and rapid reaction to disturbance. Together, even without shared language or intent, they formed a loosely integrated survival system. This phase is important because it marks the point where the relationship is no longer just about proximity. It becomes about utility. The animals evolving into the dog were no longer simply exploiting human presence. They were beginning to be shaped by it in ways that made them increasingly valuable to humans, and humans, in turn, were beginning to shape the environment in ways that favored these animals' continued presence. Over many generations, this quiet feedback loop strengthened. Wolves that were more attentive to human cues survived more often. Humans that tolerated and utilized those wolves gained small but meaningful advantages in safety, hunting efficiency, and environmental awareness. Neither side needed to understand the larger process for it to continue. What emerged was not yet the modern dog in its full diversity, but something unmistakably different from its wild ancestor. A population of animals was forming that was no longer purely wolf, and not yet fully domestic dog, something in between, defined not by isolation from humans, but by increasing dependence on them. In this transitional stage, the foundation of partnership was laid, not through sudden cooperation, but through thousands of years of repeated, practical interactions that slowly turned proximity into role, and role into relationship. The rise of emotional bonding. By the time early humans had long been living alongside the ancestors of the dog, the relationship had already moved far beyond simple coexistence. What began as cautious tolerance and later developed into practical cooperation was now entering a new and far more unusual phase. Emotional attachment. This shift did not replace the older survival-based relationship, but it layered something new on top of it, something that would eventually define dogs as uniquely different from all other domesticated animals. The starting point for this change lies in the deep social nature of the gray wolf. Wolves are not solitary creatures. They live in structured packs, communicate constantly through body language and vocalizations, and maintain strong social bonds within their group. When certain wolf populations began living near humans, they did not lose this social wiring. Instead, it gradually adapted to a new environment where humans were always present, consistent, and predictable compared to the unstable dynamics of the wild. Over time, the wolves that became more successful around humans were not only those that were less aggressive, but also those that were more socially flexible. These individuals were better at reading signals, responding to attention, and adjusting their behavior based on human reactions. In a sense, they were already primed for relationship building. They just began directing those instincts toward another species. Humans, too, played an essential role in this transformation. Early humans were highly social and emotionally responsive animals themselves. They relied on cooperation, empathy, and group cohesion to survive. It is likely that they began to recognize individual animals within these semi-wild populations, a wolf that returned repeatedly to camp, that showed no aggression, or that reacted predictably to human presence, would not have been seen as interchangeable with others. Over time, familiarity began to replace fear. This familiarity is where emotional bonding begins to emerge. When humans and wolves interacted repeatedly under conditions of low threat, a feedback loop of behavior developed. Wolves that responded calmly to human presence were rewarded with tolerance or food. Humans that tolerated those wolves benefited from increased safety and environmental awareness. Each side began to associate the other not just with utility, but with predictability and comfort. The transition was likely gradual and uneven. Some early dog populations may have remained primarily functional, used for hunting assistance, guarding, or tracking, but others began to occupy a different space entirely. These animals stayed closer to humans, not just at the edge of camps, but inside them. They followed individuals rather than groups, responded to voice and gesture, and began to integrate into daily human rhythms such as rest, movement, and feeding. This proximity allowed for something rare in the natural world: cross-species social bonding. Dogs are uniquely sensitive to human emotional cues: tone of voice, posture, facial expression, and routine. Over generations, this sensitivity deepened. At the same time, humans began to interpret dog behavior through a social lens, rather than a purely utilitarian one. A wagging tail, a submissive posture, or a loyal return began to be understood not just as behavior, but as intention. Once behavior is interpreted as intention, emotional meaning follows quickly. At this stage, the relationship was no longer purely about survival advantages. It was also about companionship, reassurance, and attachment. Dogs became integrated into the human social world in a way no other animal had. They were present during rest, movement, and even vulnerability times when social bonds matter most. What makes this development extraordinary is that it was not a planned outcome. It was the result of millions of small interactions, accumulating across thousands of generations. Selection favored not just physical traits or working ability, but emotional compatibility with humans. Dogs that could bond more closely with people were more likely to be cared for, protected, and integrated into human life. In this way, the rise of emotional bonding did not replace the older functions of the relationship, it expanded them. The ancestors of modern dogs were still workers, guards, and hunting partners, but they were also becoming something entirely new. Companions whose survival was increasingly tied not only to usefulness, but to affection. And once that threshold was crossed, the bond between humans and dogs became something stable enough to endure. Across civilizations, cultures, and millennia, a relationship no longer defined solely by necessity, but by connection. Man's best friend becomes permanent. By the time the relationship between humans and the dog had reached a stage of emotional bonding, something irreversible had already taken place. The connection was no longer a temporary arrangement based on proximity or convenience. It had become a stable part of human life, one that would persist through changing environments, technologies, and civilizations. What began as cautious coexistence with the gray wolf had now transformed into a lasting partnership embedded in human culture itself. As human societies grew more complex, so did the roles of dogs. Early hunter-gatherer groups had already benefited from their abilities in tracking, guarding, and scavenging, but with the rise of agriculture and permanent settlements, the value of dogs expanded dramatically. Stable food supplies and larger communities created new risks: thieves, predators, and territorial conflict. Dogs adapted seamlessly into these environments, taking on roles as guardians of homes, livestock, and stored resources. At the same time, humans began shaping dogs more deliberately. While early domestication was largely unintentional, later generations engaged in selective breeding, favoring traits that suited specific needs. Some dogs were bred for herding, guiding livestock with precision and intelligence. Others were refined for hunting, using their speed, scent, or endurance to assist in tracking game. Still others were selected for protection, loyalty, or companionship. This diversification marked a major turning point. Dogs were no longer just evolving alongside humans, they were being actively shaped by them. Despite these functional roles, something deeper continued to develop. The emotional bond that had begun in earlier stages did not diminish. It strengthened. Dogs became embedded not only in work, but in daily life. They slept near families, accompanied journeys, and participated in the rhythms of human existence. In many cultures, they were treated not as tools, but as members of the household, beings with personality, memory, and social presence. This integration was made possible by the extraordinary flexibility of the canine social system. Unlike most domesticated animals, the ancestors of the dog retained a strong capacity for cross-species social bonding. They could interpret human gestures, respond to emotional cues, and adjust their behavior in real time to fit human expectations. This made them uniquely suited to live inside human social structures, rather than merely alongside them. Over thousands of years, this mutual adaptation became self-reinforcing. Humans increasingly depended on dogs for practical tasks and emotional support. Dogs, in turn, became increasingly dependent on humans for food, safety, and social structure. This dependency was not one-sided exploitation. It was a shared evolutionary pathway. shaped by selection on both sides. Even as human societies expanded across continents, the partnership remained consistent. From Arctic sled dogs to pastoral herders, from hunting companions to urban pets, the relationship adapted to nearly every environment humans entered. The form changed, but the core remained, a species that had evolved to live within human social worlds. What makes this bond unique in natural history? Its permanence. Many domesticated species serve humans, but few are integrated so deeply into emotional and social life. Dogs are present not only in work, but in companionship, comfort, and identity. They respond to human voices, follow human routines, and often prioritize human interaction over their own species. In this way, the transformation from wolf to companion reached its final stage not as an endpoint, but as a stable condition. The dog had become something new in the history of life, an animal whose evolution is inseparable from a single other species. Man's best friend is not just a poetic phrase, it is the outcome of a relationship that proved durable enough to survive the rise of cities, empires, and modern life. And unlike many ancient partnerships, it never ended. It simply continued, generation after generation, until it became one of the most familiar relationships in the human world, so familiar that its deep evolutionary history is often invisible. But behind every dog lying on a couch today is a lineage that stretches back to wild wolves, long nights at the edge of camps, and countless small moments where survival slowly turned into connection, and connection became permanence. The story of the dog is not the story of a sudden invention or a single moment of domestication. It is the outcome of a long, gradual transformation that began with the wild gray wolf and unfolded across tens of thousands of years of shared environments, accidental encounters, and repeated survival pressures. What started as hostility at the edges of human existence slowly shifted into cautious tolerance, then practical cooperation, and eventually emotional connection, each stage built on the one before it, shaped not by intention alone, but by the quiet force of selection, behavioral, environmental, and social. Wolves that could exist near humans survived differently. Humans who tolerated and benefited from their presence adapted in return. Over time, those small advantages accumulated into something far larger than either species could have planned. In the end, the bond between humans and dogs became more than functional. It became embedded in daily life, culture, and emotion. Dogs evolved into companions capable of reading human behavior, responding to human emotion, and integrating into human social structures in ways unmatched by any other animal. What was once a boundary between predator and prey became a shared space of cooperation and trust. Today, when a dog rests beside a person, it is easy to forget how unusual that relationship is in the natural world. But behind that quiet moment lies a deep history of adaptation and change, a journey from survival on opposite sides of the wild to a partnership that has lasted longer than most civilizations. The transformation was never sudden, and it was never simple, but it was lasting, and that is why, even now, the connection between humans and dogs remains one of the most enduring relationships in all of nature.